Well, it's August, and I've declared August Classics Month, and this gives me a chance to talk about some albums that I've been wanting to talk about for a while that I just never really got the chance or got around to. So I'm going to upload like 2 or 3 videos each week in August talking about some classic albums, and I figured this would be a really good place to start for me because this was an album that really made a huge impact on my musical tastes. Before we actually do dive into it, I'm not going to rate any of these guys like I normally do. I'm just going to talk about it and just give my general impressions, the context at which I was introduced to it, kind of give it along like those lines rather than like giving it like a full rating, because like all of these albums are masterpieces that I'm going to be talking about, so it just kind of feels a little derivative to give them ratings at the end of it. So anyway, let's dive into it. Script for a Jester's Tear by Marillion. So Marillion, they are kind of the first on the scene in terms of the neoprog sphere. This album is kind of a landmark album as well. Like when I talk about genre defining albums, this is the poster child for that. There was a little bit of a mad race to replenish, revigorate, breathe new life into a progressive rock scene in the early 80s, because by the late 70s, progressive rock was kind of dead. You know, a lot of those bands that were touting the prog flag weren't necessarily making big progressive rock music. I mean, Genesis had put out And Then There Were Three. Yes put out Tornado. And in a couple of years, you know, you would have King Crimson doing a lot of their more avant-garde jazz fusion kind of stuff. So not a whole lot of like progressive rock being done, because I think the landscape was kind of done with it. But the landscape really kind of wasn't. So there was a lot of like, well, what do we do from here? And so the neoprog scene was really starting to ramp up in the early 80s, and Marillion was one of the first on the scene. I mean, it was kind of, as I mentioned, a mad dash between Marillion and IQ and Pendragon and a lot of these other neoprog groups, but they all kind of had a lot of things that were very similar. And I feel like Script for a Jester's Tear kind of planted the flag and was like, this is the new sound for prog. This is what prog is going to be sounding like in this new context of the 80s. So they were kind of blending a lot of different things that were going along in this time frame. Like the music in the 80s was very strange because in some cases they were stripping a lot back. You know, you don't have that big symphonic style of rock that you had from the 70s. There was like experimentation, but less in terms of music presentation and like music orchestration and things like that, and a lot more in terms of production side of things. Like there was a lot more in terms of experimenting behind the scenes and doing a lot with different sounds. I mean, new age, new wave, synth pop, synth wave, like all those were making the scene, and it was very experimental and very like playing around with different sounds. But in terms of like song construction, song writing ship, everything was very stripped back into the usual chorus, verse, bridge, chorus, verse. That really like is very simplistic and very, you know, minimalistic in that sense. And so there was this big appetite for a lot of the more symphonic presentation, a lot more of the sophistication within the musical styles, and this is where a lot of the neo-prog kind of came into the fold. Along with that, you still had a lot of the more angsty, more rage-filled musical expressions that would be inherited from punk. And Marillion, especially within the lyrical content and Fish's vocal ranges and vocal presentations, definitely feature this. And coming off of the EP and a lot of the touring that they were doing with Market Square Heroes the previous year in 1982, we have their full-length debut album within 1983. And it really did take the prog sphere by storm. And a lot of bands saw what Marillion and IQ were doing at the time and started to emulate that. And again, that's where you get the Pendragons, that's where you get the Arenas, that's where you get like even more modern prog stuff like Mystery and Comedy of Errors. And so it really did create this musical expression by marrying a lot of different techniques that were going on at the time. And I know a lot of people think that this style is kind of derivative. It's leaning too heavily on on Genesis or Vandergraaf Generator or a lot of the other bands that came before them. But what I think is that they recontextualized it in a landscape that was starved for expressions such as this. So that kind of gives you the context for where this album is coming into, coming out of the UK, where everybody was leaning really, really hard on punk, and punk was starting to phase out as the new wave and synth pop was starting to make its presence known. And so this kind of came into the sweet spot in that case that would then usher forth the whole neoprog movement. And yeah, I mean, it's for great reasons. You've got the lineup that was pretty much solidified. I mean, the drummers would kind of come and go, but you got Fish on vocals that would lead the band for another 3 albums after this. Steve Rothery, Mark Kelly, Pete Travis, and Mark Pointer. And Mark would eventually leave and somebody else would come on. But yeah, Steve Rothery on the acoustic guitar and on the guitars, maybe leaning a little heavily on the David Gilmour-esque style of sounds, but presenting it in a more like Yes landscape. You have a lot of those very emotional, soaring guitar works that Gilmour has, but applying it to a much more symphonic presentation, a lot more dark. Like, this is a very, very dark album, and the neoprog's movement was very dark. It was very melodramatic, and this is led with Mark Kelly on the piano, and he is leaning very heavily on a lot of his inspirations like Tony Banks or Rick Wakeman, and Pete Travis on the bass. He carries through so very well in terms of the rhythm sections. Mick, on drums, he's fine. He's probably the weaker link, which is probably why he left the band and somebody else would come through. And so we've got 6 songs on this album. And one of the things that really made me fall in love with this album, this was in my second wave of prog. So I had consumed everything from Yes and Genesis, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, King Crimson, and all of them. And I was hungry for more. And I saw this album in my father's record collection and put it on. And within the first couple of notes, I was swept away. I loved the very angst-filled, very aggressive style of lyrics and singing, married with a darker symphonic presentation of music. I just loved how rich and full both the lyrics and the music were. It was very melodramatic in both sense. It was very theatrical. Script for a Jester's Tear is a perfect kind of moniker for this, because it really is like the 2 masks within the theater thing. And I mean, as a theater teenager, because I saw this when I was a teenager, this was itching all of the scratches that I had. It was just perfectly placed where a lot of my friends were getting into kind of the emo phase, because this would have been probably about 2002, 2003. So nu metal was really, really big at the time. Emo was just coming in. So there was a lot of very emotional outpours. Like My Chemical Romance was huge at the time. Fall Out Boy would be coming just around the corner. And so there was so much of this angst-filled music, this angst-filled lyrics. And it was very simple. And in some cases, there is a case to be made, and there is a place for that. But I was craving a little bit more sophistication. I was craving a little bit more thought-provoking poetry within my music. And man, does this band ever deliver. This Wedding Now Awake, The Needles Make Love to the Junkies. There's so much juice to be found in this lyrical content. That's a very angsty teenager from a very white suburban neighborhood. I was just this is exactly what I was looking for, surrounded by extremely symphonic, complex music around it. So I've kind of moved all around here. Let's talk about the individual tracks here. The album opens up with the title track of Script for a Jester's Tear, and this might still be one of the best tracks that Marillion has ever written, and it was one of the tracks that might not have even been on the album proper. This was kind of a last-minute addition, but I love how it opens up with... It almost opens up the same way that Genesis's Dancing with the Moonlit Night opens up, where it's somber, it's soft to begin with, and then it just rises into this massive crescendo that then carries on the track proper. You're filled with the melodrama, you're filled with this angst that's found within it. I love how like aggressive it is at times without being extremely sharp, because that was something that Fish really commanded. He commanded like the knife's edge without completely penetrating. You know, he would put the tension on, he would make the skin bend, but he would never quite penetrate. And I love that because it just added so much tension and so much raw energy to it. And then it goes into actually the smallest track, or the shortest track, of He Knows You Know, which was kind of being billed as one of the singles off of this track, off of this album. This one and Garden Party were the two that like helped drive up some buzz for this. And I love He Knows You Know. I love how menacing it is, how sinister it is at times. You know, this kind of puts down the framework for a lot of Marillion's tracks moving forward. Then we come into The Web, a very complex, very like sophisticated track. I love how complex it can be, how cinematic it is in terms of the lyrical content on it. I mean, it does kind of lean a little bit on the Peter Gabriel kind of storytelling aspect of it, but it also goes to show how well Fish really orchestrates and pens a story within The Web. And I love, like, the one thing that I love on here is Mark Kelly's piano work on it, kind of just like almost dancing on top of everybody else as he's noodling away on it. And I love how the track opens up with "And thus begins the web," and at the end of it was "And thus ends the web." And both lyrics are mirrored very well within the actual music on it. At the beginning, it's very menacing, it's very hopeless, it's very dark, and at the end it's almost like got this whimsical, optimistic side of it. Then we come into probably the most whimsical track on it, the first track off of the second side of Garden Party, and I love how bouncy this track is. You know, it's not just doom and gloom, it's not just dark, it's not just like neon signs and whatnot. Like, there's a lot of fun that's being found on Garden Party. I love how, as I mentioned, whimsical it is. This is where that Jester is kind of dancing around the courtyard, being the fool, and allowing that fun to drive up, because it's these contrasts that really hammer home the melodrama, because you need to have the elevated, fun, whimsical aspects to drive home that darker aspects of it. And coming into Chelsea Monday, I'm not a big fan of this one. This might be like the lowest point on the album, but even Chelsea Monday is still fun. Again, Mark Kelly's playing styles on the keyboards mixed with Steve Rothery on the guitar work. Like, I love how they kind of bounce back and forth between one another. Really, really well done. And this was one thing that really kind of was a staple to neoprog, having this, I don't want to say duel, but passing the baton really quickly between the keyboards and the guitar, and allowing both to really take up some really meaty space and some really juicy atmospheres in that case. And then finally we come to the closing track of Forgotten Sons, and even though like Fish has come out and said that it's not really a protest song, it's not really a anti-war song or anything like that, it definitely has the inflections of that. You know, we're talking about, especially near the end point, where there's this rhythm section that's very militaristic, and it's almost got like this war chant of almost like this war prayer at times. And man, the ending of that track with Steve Rothery on the guitar works just soars to a whole nother level. It really does usher in this brilliance and this landscape that allows everybody to kind of play within it. And once again, all of these tracks don't follow that traditional songwriting style that a lot of the tracks of the day were doing. And I love how they didn't allow the conventional verse, chorus to be the structure for the track. They allowed the story to be the structure for the music to then kind of crowd around it. By the end of Forgotten Sons, I am just like both drained and fulfilled musically. As a teenager, this fulfilled and really like nurtured my soul in terms of providing that very angst-filled, very like almost call to arms aspects, and very angsty, but the music around it wasn't so simplistic, and it was, you know, very complex and very thought out in that case. So yeah, Script for a Jester's Tear kind of hit the prog sphere and just exploded the whole neo-prog movement. And I mean, how can it not? Yeah, it really defined the genre. Like, this was what people were measuring all the albums afterwards. Yeah, that's all I've really got for Script of a Jester's Tear. I have a feeling most people have heard it by now, but if you haven't, I highly, highly recommend it. Nathan on Shuffle and I did a ranking of Marillion's albums, and if you haven't seen it, it's up there. And this one is still my favorite from them. It's still one that I come back to every time, and I feel very rewarded, very nurtured by this album. Even after we're coming on to 40 years, if you can believe it, for this album, and it still feels fresh. It still feels new. Like in some cases, it definitely feels, of the time, but it never feels dated. It always feels very lush in that case. So yeah, that's what I've got for Script of a Jester's Tear. Brilliant and beautiful album, an absolute masterpiece. If you haven't already heard it, please do yourself a favor, go and listen to it. This was my introduction to neoprog, and it's still the beacon of light that it really should be. And so that's all I've got for it. What did you guys think about this album? It's a very famous and popular one, so whatever you thought, whether you loved it or you hated it, let me know by commenting down below. And that's all I've got for you guys today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm having a blast talking about some of these classic albums. As I mentioned, this is the first one, so get ready for a lot more. Yeah, that's all I've got for you. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.